Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff where the wind blows hot and dry, carrying the scent of ancient dust and salt. Below you, the earth drops away sharply, plummeting down more than 1,300 feet to the shimmering blue waters of the Dead Sea. It is the lowest point on the face of the planet. The sun beats down relentlessly, turning the Judean Desert into a vast, golden ocean of rock and sand. In the middle of this desolate landscape rises a giant, a flat-topped plateau shaped like a loaf of bread, standing alone against the sky. This is Masada. And in the year 73 CE, it was not just a fortress. It was the last heartbeat of a nation. To understand how this remote rock became the stage for one of history's most famous stories, we have to go back to a quiet morning inside the fortress walls. The air is surprisingly cool up here, shielded from the desert glare by massive stone walls that have stood for centuries. Walking through the main courtyard, you might hear the soft chatter of women weaving cloth, or the rhythmic sound of a pestle grinding grain in a stone mortar. Children are playing near the cisterns, their laughter echoing off the cliffs, a stark contrast to the silence of the empty lands stretching out in every direction. At the center of this community stands a man named Eleazar ben Yair. He is tall, with a beard streaked with gray and eyes that have seen too much sorrow. Eleazar is a leader of the Sicarii, a group known for their fierce passion, but here on Masada, he is simply a protector. As he walks along the ramparts, his hand traces the rough stones of the wall. He isn't just looking at the horizon. He is looking for a future. He is responsible for the lives of 960 men, women, and children who look to him for safety. Every face he sees tells a story of survival, of narrow escapes, and of families torn apart by war. This place wasn't always a refugee camp. Centuries earlier, King Herod the Great built Masada as a pleasure palace, a getaway for kings. He had constructed elaborate swimming pools, bathhouses filled with steam, and storehouses large enough to feed an army. But now, the elegant mosaics were covered in dust, and the swimming pools were empty, repurposed as cisterns to catch every precious drop of rainwater. The luxury was gone, replaced by a desperate need for survival. Yet, in a way, the people felt lucky. They had water. They had food. They had high walls. And most importantly, they had each other. Life here had a strange rhythm. The days were spent repairing the defenses and tending to the small gardens that grew in the shade of the northern palace. They had brought seeds with them, dates, figs, and olives, and they coaxed life out of the barren rock. It was a small miracle, a green thumbprint on a red and brown world. For a while, it felt like they had found a sanctuary. They were far away from the burning cities and the marching legions. They believed that the sheer cliffs of Masada were protection enough. But then the wind changed. It wasn't just the heat anymore. It carried a new sound, low and rhythmic, like the beating of a giant heart. It started as just a rumor, a whisper from a scout who had ventured down the snake path in the dark of night. He returned breathless, his eyes wide with fear. "They are coming," he whispered. "A wall of iron is moving through the desert." At first, the people didn't want to believe it. They had run so far. They had climbed so high. But the next morning, the horizon told a different story. The sun rose to reveal a sight that must have turned their blood to ice. The vast, empty floor of the desert was no longer empty. It was covered in tents. Thousands of them, laid out in perfect, orderly rows, stretching as far as the eye could see. This wasn't a raiding band or a small patrol. This was the full might of the Roman Empire. The banners of the 10th Legion, the Legio Ex Fretensis, snapped in the wind, their golden eagles glinting in the sunlight. The Romans had arrived, and they had not come to talk. Leading them was General Flavius Silva, a man known for his patience and his engineering genius. Silva sat atop his horse, surveying the fortress above him with cold, calculating eyes. He was a soldier who solved problems, and right now, Masada was a problem that needed to be solved. The Jewish revolt, which had been raging for 7 years, was nearing its end. Jerusalem had fallen 3 years prior. In the year 70 CE, the Great Temple was destroyed, and the heart of the Jewish nation had been broken. But Silva knew that as long as Masada held out, the fire of rebellion still burned. He was here to extinguish that flame once and for all. Imagine the feeling on the ramparts that day. Eleazar stood beside his people, looking down at the army below. The contrast was terrifying. Down there were 8,000 highly trained, heavily armed soldiers. They had siege engines, battering rams, and horses. They had the resources of an empire behind them. Up on the rock, there were 960 souls, mostly civilians, with a handful of fighters among them. The math didn't add up. Logic said they were doomed. But Eleazar knew that human beings don't fight with logic alone. They fight with the desperate courage of those who have nothing left to lose. The Romans didn't attack immediately. They didn't need to. They began the most terrifying part of any siege, the waiting. Silva ordered his men to build a wall, a circumvallation, completely encircling the base of the mountain. It was a ring of stone and lime, 7 miles long, guarded by small forts. It was a psychological weapon, a message that said, there is no way out. You are trapped. They were not mythical heroes. They were mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters. They were people who wanted to live, to see their children grow up, and to watch the olive trees they planted bear fruit. But they were also people who realized that some things are more important than survival itself. And that is a lesson that echoes through the ages, reminding us that while empires rise and fall, the human spirit remains unbreakable. Picture the western face of Masada. It is a massive, jagged slab of rock, towering over the desert floor. For centuries, it stood untouched, a natural barrier that seemed to say, no further. But as the winter of 73 E turned into the spring of 74 CE, this view changed dramatically. A giant scar began to appear on the side of the mountain. It was a ramp being built by the Roman army, and it was one of the most ambitious engineering projects in the ancient world. This ramp was not just a pile of dirt. It was a highway to war. The Romans, led by General Flavius Silva, knew that climbing the vertical cliffs was suicide. So, they decided to change the shape of the mountain itself. They utilized a natural geological formation called the White Promontory, a raised spur of rock that acted as a foundation. From there, thousands of men set to work. Imagine the noise, the clinking of picks against stone, the rumble of wooden carts, the shouted orders of officers. It was a symphony of construction that echoed through the canyons. But here is where the story becomes truly heartbreaking. The Romans didn't use their own highly trained soldiers to do the heavy lifting. They used Jewish prisoners of war. These were people captured from other villages and towns during the long years of the revolt. Imagine the torment of the defenders on top of the plateau. Every morning, Eleazar ben Yair and his people looked down to see their own brothers and sisters, their cousins and neighbors, forced to build the very machine that would destroy them. It was a cruel psychological weapon, designed to break their spirits before a single arrow was fired. The defenders shouted down to them, encouraging them to stop, but the prisoners had no choice. Lash cracks and Roman swords drove them forward. The ramp grew higher every day. It was a massive triangle of earth and stone, rising at a steep angle. The engineers used timber and iron to reinforce the sides, holding back the tons of rubble. To this day, you can still visit the site and see the remains of this ramp. It is a testament to Roman determination, standing hundreds of feet high. It took months of backbreaking labor. While the Romans ate their rations and slept in tents, the defenders on Masada watched their doom inch closer and closer. It must have felt like a slow-motion nightmare. However, Eleazar and his people were not just sitting idly by. They were resilient, and they were smart. They knew that once the ramp reached the top, the Romans would bring their siege engines. These were massive towers, taller than the walls of the fortress, covered in iron plates to stop arrows. They were terrifying beasts of wood and metal. But Eleazar had a plan. He ordered the construction of a second wall, built right behind the original stone fortification. This was not a wall of stone. It was a wall of wood and earth. The logic was brilliant. They took the heavy wooden beams from the royal palace, the very roof that had sheltered King Herod, and they built a thick barrier. They packed it tight with earth and clay. The idea was simple. When the Roman battering ram struck, the wood would flex and the earth would absorb the shock. A stone wall cracks and shatters under a heavy blow, but a wall of wood and earth yields. It's like punching a pillow compared to punching a concrete wall. The defenders worked through the night, sweating and hammering, knowing that this strange, soft wall was their only hope. Finally, in the spring, the ramp was finished. It connected the desert floor to the summit. The silence that fell over the camp must have been deafening. Everyone, Ramang and Jew alike, held their breath. Then the ground shook. The Romans began to move their siege tower up the ramp. It was a monumental task. The structure was incredibly heavy, likely weighing dozens of tons. Thousands of soldiers and oxen strained against ropes, pulling the tower inch by inch up the slope. From the top of Masada, the sight must have been terrifying. The tower loomed larger and larger as it crested the ramp. It cast a long, dark shadow over the defenders. Archers were stationed inside the tower, raining arrows down on the zealots, forcing them to keep their heads down. The Romans were using their height to suppress the defense. It was a tactical masterpiece. When the tower finally reached the wall, the battle began in earnest. The Romans lowered the battering ram, a massive iron-headed log, and began to swing. The rhythm of the siege began. Asterisk, boom, boom, boom. Asterisk, the ground vibrated with every strike. The defenders inside the fortress could feel the impacts in their feet. The air filled with dust and the screams of battle. But then, something unexpected happened. The ram struck the new inner wall, and it didn't break. The wood groaned and creaked. The earth shifted, but the wall held. The Romans struck again, harder. Still, it held. The defenders on the wall cheered. It was a moment of pure joy and relief. Against all odds, their clever idea had worked. The invincible Roman army had been stopped by a wall of wood and dirt. For a while, it seemed like a miracle. The Romans withdrew, confused and frustrated. They tried to set fire to the wall with torches, but the wind was against them, blowing the flames back. The defenders on the wall were brave, dousing the small fires that started, throwing buckets of water and sand. Eleazar must have felt a surge of hope. Perhaps they could survive this after all. Perhaps God really had placed a shield around them. They were fighting a giant, and for a brief, shining moment, the little guy was winning. But General Silva was a patient man. He knew that persistence is the key to victory. He watched the wind. He saw that the direction of the breeze was changing. He waited for the moment when the desert winds would shift in his favor. When that moment came, he ordered a massive assault. The faces of the 960 men, women, and children were illuminated in the glow. These were people who had traveled a long road together. They had lost their homes, their temple, and their country. Now they stood on the edge of losing their freedom. Eleazar looked at them, his family, his friends, his people. He saw the fear in their eyes, but he also saw something else. He saw a spark that refused to be extinguished. Eleazar began to speak. His voice wasn't loud. It was gentle, filled with the sadness of a father who must guide his children through a final storm. He spoke to them not about death, but about life. He reminded them of who they were. "My friends," he said, "we were the first to revolt against Rome, and we are the last to fight. We have been given a gift this night. The Romans are asleep. The fates have given us the chance to choose our own ending." He spoke about the nature of freedom. It is a concept that resonates with every human being, no matter where they live or what century they are in. Eleazar told them that a life lived in chains, where someone else dictates your movements, your words, and your worship, is not a life at all. It is a slow death. He argued that it was better to leave this world as free souls, beloved by God and faithful to their truth, than to live as slaves, paraded through the streets of Rome as trophies for an emperor. The mood in the room shifted. It wasn't about anger toward the Romans anymore. It was about love for each other and for their heritage. They realized that they had one final act of agency left. They could not control the Roman army. They could not control the siege engines, but they could control their own spirits. They could determine how their story would end. This realization transformed the fear into a strange, peaceful resolve. Now they had a practical problem to solve. They had made a pact to leave this life together, to keep their families intact and protect them from the horror of slavery. They gathered all their possessions, their furniture, their clothes, their gold, and their food, and piled them into a great stack in the open courtyard. They set them on fire. The flames shot up into the night sky, a bright beacon against the darkness. The heat from the fire was intense, warming the cool desert air. It was a symbolic act, a way of saying that they were taking nothing with them, leaving nothing for the conquerors. As the fire crackled and roared, Eleazar outlined the plan. 10 men were chosen by lot to carry out the final wish of the community. These men were not executioners. They were servants, tasked with the heavy burden of ensuring everyone went peacefully. Imagine the scene as this plan unfolded. It was not a chaotic riot. It was orderly. Families walked to the fire. Husbands embraced their wives one last time. Parents held their children close, whispering words of love and courage. There were tears, of course. How could there not be? But there was also a profound sense of closeness. Every person there knew that they were not alone. They were surrounded by their community, held in a circle of love that was stronger than the Roman legions below. One by one, they lay down beside the fire. They looked up at the stars, the same stars their ancestors had looked at for thousands of years. They passed peacefully, falling into a deep sleep from which they would not wake. The 10 chosen men walked among them, fulfilling their duty with heavy hearts but steady hands. The noise of the fire drowned out the world, and the smell of smoke masked the scent of the desert. When the task was done, and the 960 souls lay at rest, the 10 men returned to the center of the courtyard. They looked at the quiet faces of their friends and family, sleeping in the firelight. They had honored their pledge. Now, it was time for them to fulfill the final part of the promise. They cast lots once more among themselves. A man named Joseph ben Yair was chosen as the last one standing. The remaining 9 men laid down their weapons and embraced their comrade. Then they, too, lay down to rest. Joseph checked on everyone, ensuring they were peaceful. He walked through the palace one last time, seeing the silence that had fallen over Masada. He was truly alone, the last conscious soul on the mountain. He looked toward the east, where the sky was just beginning to turn gray. He knew the Romans were waking up. He knew that in a few hours they would storm the fortress, but they would find no battle. They would find only the silence of free people. Joseph returned to the fire. He looked at the empty place where the wall used to be, then back at the silent sleepers. With a final prayer on his lips, he joined them. The fire continued to burn, slowly dimming as the fuel was consumed. The only movement on the entire mountain was the flickering of the flames and the shifting of the shadows. As the sun began to crest over the mountains of Moab, turning the Dead Sea into a sheet of gold, the Romans prepared for their attack. The soldiers of the 10th Legion strapped on their armor, sharpened their swords, and formed up at the base of the ramp. They were expecting a fight. They expected arrows, stones, and desperate screams. General Silva gave the signal, and the centurions led the charge up the ramp, their boots kicking up dust, their battle cries echoing off the canyon walls. They burst through the breach in the wall, shields raised, ready for combat. But they were met with silence. The Romans stopped in their tracks. The noise of the army died away, replaced by the crackling of the dying fire. They lowered their shields, confused. As they moved further into the fortress, they saw the piles of burnt belongings. Then they saw the people. It was a sight that stopped the heart of even the most hardened veteran. The Romans were accustomed to war, to blood and noise, but this was different. There was no violence here, only a stillness that demanded respect. General Silva rode into the courtyard and saw the scene. He ordered his men to stand down. There was no looting, no celebrating. Even the enemy recognized the magnitude of what had happened. They saw that these people had not been defeated. They had simply left. However, the story was not completely over. In the excitement and the movement of the crowd, 2 women and 5 children had hidden themselves in a deep underground cistern, a water storage pit. They had been too afraid to join the others, and in the darkness, they were overlooked. When the Romans discovered them, they were terrified, expecting to be killed. Instead, General Silva treated them with kindness. He realized that these women were the key to understanding the mystery of the mountain. These 7 survivors came out of the cistern, blinking in the bright morning sun. They were the only witnesses to the final night. They told the Romans the story of Eleazar's speech, the fire, and the choice. Through them, the story of Masada was preserved and passed down to history. Their survival ensured that the bravery and the unity of the defenders would never be forgotten. Today, when you visit Masada, you can still feel the power of this place. The ruins of the palace are still there. The ramp is still scarred into the side of the cliff, and the view of the Dead Sea is just as breathtaking. But people don't come just to see the rocks. They come to remember what happened here. They come to pay their respects to 960 human beings who decided that their freedom was worth more than their lives. The lesson of Masada is not one of sadness, but of incredible strength. It teaches us that the human spirit is unbreakable. We may face walls that seem too high, challenges that seem too big, and situations that feel hopeless. But like Eleazar and his people, we always have a choice. We can choose to hold on to our dignity, our values, and our love for one another, no matter what the world throws at us. In 1969, archaeologists excavating the site found small pieces of pottery with names written on them. They believe these were the lots used by the 10 men to determine their fate. Holding those small shards of clay, you are connected directly to that night. You can feel the presence of real people who loved, laughed, and struggled just like we do. The story ends on a note of remembrance. Every year, new soldiers in the Israeli army climb the snake path at night, just before their induction ceremony. They stand on the summit where the fortress once stood. They look out over the desert as the sun rises, just as Eleazar did. They take an oath: Masada shall not fall again. It is a promise to never give up, to always fight for the right to live freely, and to remember the cost of liberty. So, as we finish our journey to this desert fortress, take a moment to think about your own Masada. What are the things that matter most to you? What are the values that you would stand up for? The defenders of Masada teach us that true strength isn't just about physical power. It's about the courage of your convictions. They turned the tragedy into an eternal symbol of hope. And that is a light that will never go out.